So as we saw in our introductory lecture, a fallacy is basically an error in reasoning. It's a flawed argument where premises are given that don't logically support a conclusion. However, fallacies are effective and therefore worth our while to learn because even though they're not logically strong, they can be psychologically persuasive, and therefore we might go along with a fallacy when we shouldn't as critical thinkers. Now, this first class of fallacies we're going to be looking at are fallacies of relevance. And in this class of fallacies, you have evidence presented that has no logical connection really to the conclusion. However, it may appear that the premises have a logical connection when in fact it's a psychological connection. So we're going to learn the various ways in which this can occur, and then we'll survey and look at various examples of these types of fallacies in this particular presentation. Here's a basic list of some common fallacies of relevance, and these are the ones we're going to be working through during this slideshow. It looks like a pretty long list, but actually most of these are fairly simple to learn and understand. So I'm going to go through them, and basically for each one I'm going to give you a basic theoretical overview, talk about the nature of the fallacy in general, and then give you lots of examples so you can distinguish them from each other. So here's a list of some common fallacies of relevance, and these are the fallacies we're going to be covering in this slideshow. We've got the appeal to pity and the appeal to force. Those will be the ones we begin with, and those are probably the easiest to learn. We have the appeal to the people, which has a few different varieties. We have the argument against the person, which is also called the ad hominem argument, as we will see. And then straw man, red herring, missing the point, and the genetic fallacy. So it looks like a fairly long list. However, most of these are pretty simple to understand, and as we go through this PowerPoint, I'll give you a brief overview of the general nature of the fallacy, and then we're going to spend a lot of time going over lots of examples to help you get the basic idea. So our first fallacy in this category is the appeal to pity. And we're going to look at the general nature of this fallacy, and I'll give you some examples, and after we do so, you could perhaps come back to this little cartoon here and see why it's committing the fallacy of the appeal to pity. In this fallacy, an arguer attempts to support a conclusion by merely evoking pity from the listener. This form of fallacy attempts to play on our emotions rather than offering genuine evidence for a conclusion. So the idea here is that someone's trying to convince us of a conclusion merely because we feel sorry for them, and they don't offer any other evidence. This is different than appealing to our emotions in addition to offering evidence, which may or may not be a fallacy. But when there's no evidence offered except the feeling of pity, then we have a fallacy being committed. And here's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Someone gets pulled over for a traffic violation and says, "Please, officer, don't give me a ticket. My parents will take the car away from me and my life will be miserable." So this person is appealing to pity on the part of the officer. The problem is that the evidence given for the conclusion that this person shouldn't get a ticket isn't really relevant to whether or not the person should get a ticket. Even if we accept it as true that this person's life will be miserable and their parents will take the car away, that's not an argument against getting a ticket. The argument against getting a ticket is that the person didn't actually break the law, and that would be relevant to the conclusion, but these facts are not. And so we have an example of the fallacy of the appeal to pity committed here. And here's another example of the same sort of thing. A student comes to a professor and says, "Professor, I really need an A in this course, even though I only have enough points for a C. If I don't get an A, then I won't be able to complete my nursing major, and I'll be forced to drop out of college." Now, we can assume that those claims are true. However, the problem is not that they're true, but rather are they relevant to the conclusion? And even if they were true, that isn't any evidence that this person deserves an A in the class, especially when we know that they only have enough points for a C. This is an example of an appeal to pity where there's no evidence for the conclusion except for the feeling of pity that this person attempts to evoke from the professor. All right, so that's one fallacy down, and now we're going to move on to the appeal to force. The appeal to force is structurally similar to the appeal to pity, but it replaces a threat of harm with an appeal to our sympathies. So we are threatened with harm if we don't go along with the conclusion. Now, obviously, we don't want to be harmed, and so that can be an effective psychological tactic, but of course it's not providing any logical reasons why we should accept a conclusion. So in the appeal to force, an arguer threatens either implicitly or explicitly to harm a listener in some way, physically, psychologically, emotionally, economically, if that person does not accept the arguer's conclusion. So here a fallacy is committed because the only evidence given for the conclusion is the threat, and therefore we have a different kind of fallacy of relevance than the appeal to pity, but structurally it has the same dynamic. No actual evidence is given, but we might be psychologically persuaded to accept the conclusion because we don't want to be harmed, and that's why this fallacy can be effective, but it's not logically sound. So here's an example. Professor says to the class, "I know you're going to find all my jokes funny. In the past, all those who haven't laughed have failed the course." Here, the professor is threatening students who don't laugh at his jokes with failing the class. Now, that isn't any evidence that the jokes are funny, so there's no logical relevance of the threat to the conclusion. However, this could be effective because failing a class is being harmed, and so therefore the students might be psychologically motivated to go along with this professor and may even laugh at the jokes, even if they're not funny, to avoid the threat of harm. Here's another example. Melvin says, "Boss, why do I have to work weekends when nobody else in the company does?" And the boss responds, "Am I sensing insubordination? I could find another employee very quickly thanks to Craigslist, you know." So here, the boss has not given Melvin any reason why he's being singled out to come in to work on the weekends. The only evidence he's presenting is that if Melvin doesn't do so, Melvin's going to be fired, and that's an implicit threat in what he is saying. Now, of course, Melvin has no logical reason to come into work. The boss has not presented any logical reason why he should, but he might very well be motivated to come in because he doesn't want to lose his job. And so therefore, even though it's a fallacy, it's still effective. Unfortunately for the boss, Melvin appears to be a quick learner, and he says to the boss, "I deserve a raise. You know, I saw you drinking on the job the other day, and if I report your behavior to your superiors, you'll get fired." Here again, Melvin is now committing the fallacy of the appeal to force. He hasn't presented any actual reasons why he deserves a raise. Such reasons might include being good at his job or showing up on time. Here, the only evidence for the raise is the threat to the boss to report his behavior. And once again, even though this isn't really relevant to whether or not Melvin deserves a raise, he may very well get the raise because the boss doesn't want to lose his job in this case. Our next fallacy is the appeal to the people, or the ad populum fallacy, which is actually a group of related fallacies, and these all center around our social nature as human beings, and they all play upon our desires to be accepted or included or thought of in certain ways by other people. So we'll look at the various different forms of this fallacy, which has direct and indirect forms, and we'll see how it's relevant particularly to advertising, which commits this fallacy quite a bit. So the direct version of the appeal to the people is pretty simple to understand. This is where you have a situation, let's say like someone directly appealing to a crowd of people, giving a speech, giving a sermon, something like that, where someone is directly trying to convince a crowd to accept an idea. And so what happens is that rather than giving reasons why the crowd should accept an idea, what the arguer does is excite the emotions and enthusiasm of the crowd and creates a mob mentality so that the crowd is carried away by its emotions. And again, this is called a direct appeal because you have a situation where an arguer is directly speaking to a crowd of people. So here's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, and bear in mind that this would be more effective if the person was shouting at the top of their lungs, which I'm not going to do. Ladies and gentlemen, the minds of our children are in jeopardy. Today, a reckless band of heathen teachers is shoving Darwinism down our children's throats. This mindless theory holds that human beings, the children of God, developed from mere monkeys. It holds that blind accident accounts for all of life. Down with this godless theory. Fire the heathen teachers. Return God to the classroom. So here we have an example of a person trying to rile up a crowd, to stir their emotions, because once a crowd is carried away by its emotions, it's really pretty easy to manipulate the crowd any way you want, and masterful speakers can do this, and we've seen this throughout history, basically. So here, the argument is something like that the teachers shouldn't be teaching the theory of evolution, but there's very little of that in terms of the content of what this person is saying. Rather, this person is trying to stir up anger against the teachers in order to fire them, and that's not really a reason against teaching evolution in the classroom. The direct appeal to the people is often effective because it uses emotionally charged language, words that inspire strong emotions or that inspire fear. So you can use emotionally charged language to associate positive emotions with what you are in favor of. Words like freedom, America, justice, these resonate positively with a crowd and can be used to manipulate a crowd towards an idea you want them to accept. Conversely, we have terms like terrorist, communist, murderers, madman that can be used to label those people or those ideas that we disagree with, and can be used to turn a crowd negatively against a certain idea or a certain person. So this is the tactic that people who commit this fallacy use. They use this kind of emotionally charged language in order to generate certain emotions, and then once the crowd is carried away by its emotions, they can be led anywhere the speaker really wants them to go. So that was the direct appeal to the people, and now we're going to focus on a different version, the indirect appeal to the people. This is where someone tries to get us to accept a conclusion or believe an idea or buy a product or vote for someone or something like that, not because we're part of a crowd. We don't have the same kind of direct appeal to a crowd of people, but rather the arguer appeals to our psychological relationship to others in society, how we want to be thought of. And it appeals to our desires to be included, to be part of a group, not to be left out, or to be thought of or perceived in certain ways. That is, we want to be perceived as having certain physical characteristics, being beautiful, handsome, rugged, or whatever. Or we want to be perceived as having certain psychological properties, like being clever or intelligent or sophisticated. And so the argument, the various forms of the indirect appeal to the people, play on these desires and, frankly, on these insecurities that people have in order to try to convince us of something without giving us any actual reasons why we should, except that we want to be thought of in a certain way. Let's look at some examples. The bandwagon fallacy is a very common example of an indirect appeal to the people. The idea is that you want to jump on the bandwagon. You want to be included in the group. You don't want to be left out. And so therefore you'll buy a product or go see a movie or whatever because everybody seems to be doing it and you don't want to be excluded. And so here we have an example of an Elvis record that says 50 million Elvis fans can't be wrong. So therefore the argument here is you should buy this album because lots of people have bought this album, which of course has no bearing on whether it's a good album or not. And frankly, 50 million Elvis fans can probably be wrong. Nevertheless, because we don't want to be left out, we might feel that we too need to buy this album or go see the movie so that we're included in the group. So this plays upon our social nature as human beings. We desire not to be excluded. We desire to be included. You see the bandwagon fallacy committed a lot in advertising. Here's an example. Film advertising seems to be really prone to this. You've got to see Kevin Hart's new movie right away. It must be great since it made more money than Star Wars in its first week of release. Now here the argument is this film is making a lot of money. In other words, it's very popular, and therefore you should go see it. But of course, merely because a film is popular has no relevance to whether it's a good movie or a bad movie. It just means lots of people are going to see it. And so therefore, we have an example of an attempt to manipulate us to go see a movie out of fear that we will be excluded in some way from the group. So here I've collected a few examples of the indirect appeal to the people bandwagon argument or bandwagon fallacy. McDonald's hamburgers tells us that over 99 billion people have been served, or maybe that's 99 billion hamburgers. I don't know which, but it really doesn't matter for the purposes of this fallacy. What they're trying to imply here is because McDonald's is so popular, therefore you should eat there. And the implication is you should eat there because the food is good. Now, there's no real connection between the number of people who eat at a certain place and the quality of the food. However, that's the implication they want us to draw. They want us to think, oh, this place is very popular. Look at all the people who are eating there. We don't want to be left out, so let's go eat there as well. Another common way in which this fallacy occurs is when advertisers tell us that their product is number one, or the most popular, or America's favorite pickup truck, or soda, or in this case, mascara. The idea is it's the most popular, therefore you should buy it. Otherwise, you're going to be buying something less popular, and therefore you're going to be excluded from the group that thinks this thing is the best mascara or pickup truck or best tasting soda. Here Coca-Cola says this is the drink everybody knows. So therefore, if you don't know about it, then you're going to be excluded, and you don't want to be excluded. Therefore, you should drink Coca-Cola. And after you're done drinking that Coca-Cola, you should brush your teeth with Oral-B toothpaste, especially if you're Australian, because over 1 million Australians have already tried Oral-B toothpaste. And so it seems to imply that if you don't use this toothpaste, you're not a legitimate Australian, which, of course, if you're Australian, is something you want to be included in. Or you could try Tasty Flake breakfast cereal because everyone is enjoying it. Now, obviously, that's a lie. Not everyone is enjoying it, because if they were, there would be no need for this ad, of course. But it's trying to imply that it's popular, of course, again, and you don't want to be excluded, so you too should try some Tasty Flake breakfast cereal and then brush your teeth with Oral-B toothpaste. All right, well, I think you got the idea what's going on with the bandwagon fallacy. Let's look at another variation of the indirect appeal to the people. This is the appeal to snobbery. Snobbery is a little bit different. When you're a snob, you don't want to be part of the mob. You don't want to be part of the big group. You want to be part of the small group. That is, the group that is sophisticated, that has taste, that has superior judgment. Oftentimes, high-end or expensive products are marketed to such people who like to be thought of in such a way, although regular people can be included in this fallacy as well. All right, so I think we have the idea of the bandwagon version of the indirect appeal to the people. Now let's turn to the appeal to snobbery, which is a slight variation on that theme. In the appeal to snobbery, you do want to be thought of as part of a group. It's not the big group that the bandwagon fallacy appeals to, but rather to the small group, the select few. You want to be thought of as having exquisite taste, refined judgment, and the means to afford to buy the products that represent your taste and your judgment. Very often the appeal to snobbery is used to market very expensive goods to people who want to be thought of as sophisticated in some way. So this fallacy plays upon our desire to be thought of or esteemed in a certain way by a crowd. That is, we want to be thought of as having more refined taste or more sophisticated judgment than the average person. And here's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. Anybody with a giant pile of money can buy a Mercedes, but it's only someone with sophisticated taste who can appreciate the refinements of a Jaguar. And therefore, to buy a Mercedes, you just have to be rich. But a Jaguar is chic. And if you thought that word was chic, they're not marketing to you. They're marketing to people who know the difference between being rich and being chic. Being chic means being fashionable, stylish. And so therefore they're appealing to a wealthy person's self-image, that they want to be thought of as having exquisite taste. They're fashionable. They have sophistication. Advertising that appeals to snobbery often refers to exclusivity, how only the select few can understand and appreciate the subtle features of this product. For example, it's not just anyone who can appreciate the fine features of the Jaguar XJK1000. We're not selling this to the mob. They don't get it, but you get it. You have taste and sophistication. This is the product just for you. So when you're committing the appeal to snobbery, you don't appeal to the mob, you're appealing to the snob. Here's an example I found in a magazine, and I thought it was so bizarre I'd share it with you. It's an ad for a Moen faucet, and it shows a Moen faucet featured prominently in the foreground, and it looks like a gathering at a house. Some women are talking, maybe it's a party, and the ad says, "Buy it for bragging rights." And if you look at the copy down below, it says, "Some people buy a Moen for their top-rated customer service. Others buy Moen for their lifetime warranty. You bought Moen to turn them green with envy." So the idea is they will see that you have exquisite taste in your kitchen faucets, and that will drive them green with envy, which of course is you're appealing to your sense of sophistication, and therefore it's an appeal to snobbery. So the appeal to snobbery is an appeal to our sense of sophistication, our inner perception, how we want to be thought of in terms of our judgment. The appeal to vanity, as the name implies, appeals to our desires to look a certain way. And the idea is often associated with product marketing, where you want to look a certain way or be perceived in a certain way, and the product is then offered to you to satisfy that desire to be perceived in that way. So unlike the appeal to snobbery, the appeal to vanity is to our external appearance, how we want to be perceived. Oftentimes we're very insecure about aspects of how we're perceived, and marketers and advertisers take advantage of this. So the idea is often to associate a product with a celebrity who has the physical attribute that we desire. They have shiny hair or gleaming teeth, or they're athletic or whatever. And so the idea is we're insecure about that aspect of ourselves. This person is marketing this product that can solve that problem, and since we want to be like that person, we'll buy the product because we associate it with the celebrity's status. Now, this is a fallacy of relevance, because merely because a celebrity is using a product has no bearing on whether or not the product is effective or useful or good in any way. So it's not really a very good argument, but it is very effective in terms of advertising, for advertisers to link their product with people who have the characteristics that masses of people desire. Our next major category of fallacy is the argument against the person. This is often referred to as the ad hominem fallacy. Ad hominem is Latin for to the man, and it captures the essential feature of this particular fallacy, which is that it involves focusing on the person making the argument rather than the substance of the argument. So it's an attack on the person as a way of discrediting the person's argument. And as you can probably already determine, the person making the argument isn't really relevant to whether or not the premises or the evidence that they're giving supports their conclusion. And there are various different ways that we can attack a person, and those will be the various different forms of the ad hominem argument that we're going to look at. We'll see these in the next slide. The ad hominem argument takes a variety of forms depending on what aspect of a person we are focusing on in our attempt to discredit their argument. We could focus on their personal characteristics. We could focus on their motives for making a certain argument. We could point out that they're being hypocritical, or we could point out that they're associated with certain other people who have a bad reputation, and so therefore they, by implication, also have a bad reputation. These are the various forms of the ad hominem argument that we're going to look at. The ad hominem abusive attacks a person. The ad hominem circumstantial attacks the motives of a person for making an argument. The tu quoque, or the you-too fallacy, attacks a person for making an argument because they're hypocritical. And then the last version is called guilt by association, where we try to discredit a person by saying that they're associated with others that have a certain negative characteristic. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. The argument against the person abusive, or the ad hominem abusive, occurs when we attack the person making the argument rather than the argument itself. Now, the person making an argument is completely irrelevant to whether or not their premises support their conclusion. That is, the person is irrelevant to whether or not the argument is a good argument or a bad argument which they are offering. However, as a debate strategy, attacking the person is often very effective, and you often see this in political debates, for example. Now, this is a fallacy, of course, because, as I've mentioned, the person making the argument has no bearing on whether or not it's a good argument. However, for rhetorical purposes, this is often a very effective thing to do. In the ad hominem abusive, or argument against the person abusive, we attack the person rather than the argument the person is making. Now, the person making an argument is completely irrelevant to the main point, which is, do the premises of the argument that they're making support their conclusion? So when we point out that person is a certain kind of person, and therefore their argument is a certain kind of argument, we're not focusing on what's relevant, but as a debate strategy, this is often very, very effective. So the idea here is you commit the fallacy of ad hominem abusive when you say something like, well, you're a silly person, so therefore your argument is silly, or you're an uninformed person, therefore your argument is uninformed. So we go from the person to the argument, and that's when we commit this fallacy. So here's an example. This theory about a new cure for cancer has been introduced by a woman known for her Marxist sympathies. I don't see why we should extend her the courtesy of our attention. So the idea here is that this woman's theory, or the idea that she's presenting about this new cure for cancer, is invalidated because she herself is a Marxist. Now, it should be clear that whether or not she's a Marxist is completely irrelevant to whether or not the cure that she's talking about is effective. However, by painting her in a certain light, the idea is that her ideas are being discredited in some way. Even though that's completely irrelevant, it can be a very effective strategy. Here's another example. I realize you think that the Bears should get a new head coach because the team is not reaching its potential, but what do you know? Are you a football coach? Have you ever played the game? Obviously, your position does not hold water. So the idea here is because you're a certain kind of person who hasn't played or coached football, therefore your opinion is irrelevant to whether or not the Bears should get a new head coach. So again, same kind of thing is going on here. Merely because this person has not been a coach doesn't mean they haven't presented a good argument. That depends on what their evidence is, not on the kind of person that they are. Now I want to just pause here for a second and talk a little bit about how you deal with an ad hominem attack when someone commits it against you. And this often happens in very heated debates when people start calling each other names, and you could probably see how this could quickly descend into a rather ugly situation. However, it doesn't have to. When someone starts calling you names or starts attacking you personally, that's actually a sign that you're winning. That's actually a sign that they have no other basis on which to deal with your argument. So the worst thing you could do is start calling them names back. Rather, you just take away their power by saying, yeah, I'm that kind of person. Now can we get back to what's really relevant here, which is my argument? What's wrong with my argument? And again, they might start calling you names, and you just let them and say, okay, yes, I am that kind of person, fine, whatever. Now let's get back to the premises of my argument. And what you're going to find is most of the time people will have no idea what you're talking about, and they'll get frustrated, and usually you'll win the day. The trick is, don't take the bait and don't attack a person who's attacking you. Get them to stick to what's relevant, and you'll quickly see that they run out of ammunition. Another variation on this fallacy is the ad hominem circumstantial argument. In this variation, the person who's trying to discredit someone does not appeal to their personal characteristics per se. They don't call them a certain kind of person, like a silly person or whatever. Rather, the person who is attempting to discredit the argument does so by alluding to the circumstances that surround the person making the argument, their motivations, for example. So the idea is you're only making this argument because you stand to benefit, for example, and therefore that is claimed to be a source of discrediting your argument. So the idea is, because you're motivated to make this argument by certain interests, that in some way undermines the credibility of the argument. When, of course, the reasons why a person is making an argument have no bearing at all on whether or not it's a good argument. So it focuses on what's irrelevant, but it can often be used to imply that this person is being discredited in some way. Here's an example of the kind of thing I'm talking about, and this is a real-life example. Jose Canseco's book contained numerous claims about steroid use by famous professional baseball players. But who cares what he says? After all, he just wants to sell books and stay famous, even though his playing career is over. So a person making an argument like this is trying to discredit Jose Canseco's claims about steroid use by saying that he's only making those claims because he wants to stay famous. Which, of course, may very well be true. People often do write books to stay famous, but is really irrelevant to whether or not the claims are supported with any evidence. So by attacking the person's motives, it looks as though we're discrediting their argument when, in fact, we're focusing on what really doesn't matter at all. Another variation on the ad hominem theme is the tu quoque, or the you too version of this fallacy. And here, you claim that an argument is flawed by pointing out that the person making the argument is not acting consistently with the claims of the argument. Or, in other words, that the person making an argument is being hypocritical. So, for example, if I were to sit here and argue that you shouldn't smoke because smoking is dangerous, and while I'm making my argument, I'm smoking a cigar, you would be committing this fallacy if you were to say that your arguments are invalidated, they're useless because you're smoking, you're being a hypocrite. Now, which of course that's true, I am being a hypocrite, I'm saying you shouldn't smoke while I'm smoking a cigar. However, that doesn't make my argument bad, and that certainly doesn't make smoking good for you. The reasons that I've given are totally legitimate, and the fact that I'm a hypocrite is really completely irrelevant. However, this is often used as a way of trying to discredit somebody. Let's take a look at some examples. Here's an example of a person committing this type of fallacy. I don't see why I should accept your argument that the consumption of fast food leads to elevated cholesterol levels and a premature death. After all, you eat fast food all the time. So here, what we're trying to do is undermine a person's claims about the health dangers of eating fast food by pointing out that the person making the argument eats fast food. And that very well may be true. However, that has no bearing on whether or not the claim that they're making is legitimate. And so therefore, this is a type of an ad hominem argument because we're focusing on a characteristic of the person rather than a characteristic of the argument that the person is making. And it's the argument that is relevant, the person is irrelevant. You often see this fallacy committed in political contexts, like in a debate, for example. If one candidate says that another candidate will raise taxes, the candidate who's being attacked might respond by saying, I'm going to raise taxes. When you were in office, you raised taxes 10 times or whatever. And so the idea is you're attempting to undermine the claim by saying that the person making the claim is being hypocritical. Here's an example of this. We all know that there are some issues associating Trump with Russia in the last election. And here we have an example of President Trump committing this fallacy when he says, I have ties with Russia. Well, Obama has ties with Russia too. So he's being hypocritical when he says that that's a problem. So this is a tactic that you see often in these kinds of situations. Now, whether or not it's true that Obama has ties to Russia is completely irrelevant to whether or not Trump has ties to Russia. But it's a distraction, and if you're not on your toes, it's really easy to be misled by these kinds of claims. The last fallacy in this group of ad hominem arguments is guilt by association. Guilt by association assumes that because a person or a group is in some way related to another person or a group that carries out a certain activity, it follows that the second person or group shares all of the same properties found in the members of the first group. So, in other words, you might have heard this argument in high school where your parents get mad at you and accuse you of doing something because they saw your friends doing it, and therefore since you are friends with them, therefore you're doing it too. You're guilty by your association with them. Now, of course, merely because someone you're associated with carries out a certain activity, that does not provide any evidence that you are doing that activity, but oftentimes people make arguments of this sort. Here's an example of guilt by association. Look, pal, we know that you're involved with these robberies. We have a security video of Bob Jones robbing the Bank of America in San Marcos, and we know that Jones is your cousin. So why don't you just give yourself up? Now here, we're being accused of being involved in a bank robbery because our cousin was involved in a bank robbery. Well, we are related to our cousins, and we're associated with them in some way, but merely because we are associated with them in that way has no relevance on whether or not we are guilty of robbing banks. This is how the fallacy of guilt by association works. Our next major fallacy is the straw man fallacy. This is a very common fallacy that typically occurs when people are having a dispute. Let's say a person makes an argument. The person who commits the straw man fallacy, rather than grappling with or dealing with the original argument, doesn't do that, but rather distorts the original argument and then attacks their own distorted version of it. Usually this distortion involves exaggeration or oversimplification of the person's position. And this is called the straw man argument or the straw man fallacy, because what you're doing is you're attacking a straw man, easy to push over, rather than the real man. You're attacking a fake version of the argument, which is easy to refute, rather than the actual argument that's being given. Let's look at an example. So in this example, you have to imagine that Mr. Rankin has just given some arguments regarding equal pay for equal work, which the person who's going to commit the fallacy does not agree with. And so that person commits the straw man fallacy when they say, Mr. Rankin has just given his arguments against equal pay for equal work. It seems that what he is saying is that women should stay out of the workplace altogether. That's what Rankin wants. Well, I think we're all smart enough to reject that argument. So here, the claim that Mr. Rankin has said that women should stay out of the workplace altogether is a straw man. Mr. Rankin said nothing of the sort. In fact, he seems to be saying the exact opposite. So what the person who is committing this fallacy does is take the original argument, oversimplify or distort it, and then attack the distortion, and then say, I think we're smart enough to reject that argument. The problem is Mr. Rankin didn't make that argument. So you can see how this can be a very clever debate technique. However, you're focusing on what's completely irrelevant, which is a distortion of the original argument rather than the argument itself. The key concept in the fallacy of red herring is distraction. Rather than focusing on the argument or the subject matter at hand, the fallacy of red herring is committed when the arguer diverts the attention of the listener by changing the subject. And so you start to talk about something that's completely irrelevant or unrelated to the original topic. Let's take a look at an example. Here's an example of a red herring. You ask what I think about Frank's argument that miracles don't exist. Well, Frank is an interesting guy. The other day he dove into the pool at the sports center and his swimming trunks came off. He then decided he didn't need them, so he swam around without any clothes on for 15 minutes, and everybody in the pool was screaming. What do you think of that? That Frank's kind of a weird guy. So now you see how suddenly we went from Frank's argument about miracles not existing to talking about Frank and his unusual behavior. So we got distracted off the main topic, we followed the red herring off the trail, and now we can't reach any conclusion because we're not talking about the same subject anymore. We've been lured off into irrelevancy, and so therefore this is a fallacy of relevance because the behavior of Frank at the pool is irrelevant to his argument that was originally made. The fallacy of missing the point occurs when an argument misses the point. That is, it doesn't draw the appropriate conclusion from a given set of evidence, but rather it draws a unrelated, exaggerated conclusion that isn't reasonable from the evidence. Let's take a look at some examples. For example, recently the number of houses with swimming pools and the number of public pools has risen sharply. Along with the increasing number of swimming pools, we have also seen an increasing number of childhood deaths by drowning. To reduce the number of such deaths in the future, it is imperative that we pass a law closing public pools and making swimming illegal. This is an example of missing the point. We go from certain claims and statistics about the increasing number of childhood deaths by drowning to draw the conclusion, therefore we should make swimming illegal. Well, that would certainly reduce the number of deaths by drowning. However, it kind of misses the point, which is that those deaths could likely be decreased with certain safety measures taking place at public pools or at private pools. If we were to take those steps, like providing more lifeguards or safety fences around pools, that would accomplish the same thing without drawing this exaggerated conclusion that does miss the point, which is that safety does need to be increased. Here's another example. A college education has become unreasonably expensive. The only possible solution to this problem is to close down all of the colleges and universities. Now, that would certainly work, I imagine. That would make college cheaper if we just closed down all the colleges, but it misses the point. If college has become unreasonably expensive, a more reasonable solution would be to try to find ways to reduce those expenses. And that's exactly what this argument doesn't do. It misses the point and draws an exaggerated, irrelevant conclusion. Okay, well, the genetic fallacy is the last fallacy in our survey of fallacies of relevance, and I'm sure you're happy to hear that. Now, the genetic fallacy is where you try to either support an idea, or you can also commit this fallacy if you try to criticize an idea based on its origin, based on where it came from. In other words, its genesis. So this fallacy is called the genetic fallacy because it's attacking an idea based on its origin or its genesis. It has nothing to do with genetics like in genetic engineering. So let's take a look at a couple of examples of these fallacies of various sorts. And the idea here, of course, is that the conditions under which an idea originated, where it came from, how it was created, have really no bearing on whether or not it's true. That's just completely irrelevant. So that's why this is an example of a fallacy of relevance. So here's an example of a genetic fallacy being used to try to support an idea. The idea of human evolution must be true because it is first found in the writings of the ancient Greek philosopher Anaximander. Now, whether or not human evolution is true depends not on who thought of it or where the idea came from. It was, in fact, originally thought of by the ancient Greek philosopher Anaximander, but that doesn't mean it's true because he thought of it. Rather, human evolution is true if there's evidence to support it, and that evidence would be in the fossil record and in biology and all of the other relevant sources that we would look to support such an idea, not because it's very, very old. You see this a lot in what I call appeals to ancient wisdom. You see this often with food mysticism, for example, or medical quackery, where people will say this treatment is effective because it was used by the ancient Egyptians or something. Well, the treatment is either effective or it's not. Where it came from and who thought of it is actually irrelevant. And even if it's very ancient, that has no real bearing on whether it's a credible treatment. So this is an example of trying to use the genesis of an idea to support the idea. Let's take a look at a use of the genetic fallacy to critique an idea, and that'll be our last slide in the series. Here's an example of the genetic fallacy being used to try to critique or undermine an idea. Andrew Wiles' proof of Fermat's last conjecture cannot be accepted because Wiles has said that the original idea for the proof came to him during a feverish bout of malaria. This is no basis for a scientific conclusion. So what we're trying to do here is undermine his proof by saying that the conditions under which it originated are shady in some way or not trustworthy, that he had malaria and therefore was in a feverish state when he thought of the idea. But of course, the state he was in when he thought up the idea really isn't relevant to whether or not the idea is correct. That depends on whether or not the proof is well done. So therefore, we're focusing on the genesis or the origin of the idea, which is not relevant to whether or not the idea is true. So whether or not an argument was created under certain conditions doesn't really matter. What matters is, do the premises support the conclusion? That's ultimately the only thing that will ever be relevant when we're trying to evaluate an argument. All right, well, if you made it all the way here, congratulations. That was a pretty long presentation. There's a lot of information there. You may have to go through it more than once, and I hope that the explanations were clear. In order to reinforce what we've learned in this presentation, there are some practice exercises in the modules with attached answer keys. So please feel free, do those exercises. It will really help you to learn the fallacies. We have more fallacies coming up. The next category of fallacies will be fallacies of weak induction, and those are contained in a subsequent presentation. So before you move on to those, work through the fallacies of relevance practice exercises. Make sure you have these basic fallacies down first, and then go on to the next category.